Arrest a man suspected of having sex with a 14-year-old girl.
Arrested for offences of sexual activity with a child under 16, abduction of 2 girls.
Part of an all-too-rare operation against a hidden crime, the grooming of British children into prostitution.
Children are being sexually abused and brutalised, and we're not responding.
Often it's the children who get blamed, not the pimps.
I mean, if my sister were I can't send her back home.
The government believes 5,000 British children are being used as prostitutes. Panorama has learned that around the country, many are being traded by criminal gangs.
He pulled a gun out from under the seat and put it to my head and told me that I was going to die in 3 seconds.
What we're talking about here is young children being beaten, abused, trafficked around the country, and it's not a government priority.
Blackburn, Saturday night. Lancashire police are out looking for young girls at risk of sexual exploitation.
Just keep away from that glass. Just keep away from that glass.
Some are only 12 or 13, and the grooming starts as adolescent fun.
So what are you doing over here?
Just going to see my mate.
Are you missing at the minute? This is another area where we know young girls meet up with older males. They meet them in the park. They might come in and sit in their cars, drink alcohol, take pills, smoke joints, listen to music.
But initial friendship can soon turn ugly. For Jane, it all began one afternoon with a trip to the local town centre in Yorkshire with friends. She was 13. As with all the families in this film, we've changed her name.
The grooming starts where you meet them and they're nice to you and take you for a McDonald's and buy you cigarettes. I was flattered by it at first because older boys were interested in you, which at 13, you know, it's nice. And then you start to meet the cousins and the brothers, and they start to get older, and then you realise that you've been passed on because you hang around with older people, and they start to touch you and say, like, sexual things to you, and then the abuse starts. And I was actually pinned down by 2 other men while they raped me, and there were other men watching.
After the rape, Jane was too scared to tell her parents. She knew virtually nothing about the gang, but they knew almost every detail of her life, which they used to force her to go back.
They'll send you text messages and phone calls saying that you've got to come down now, and if you don't come down, then we're going to come and get you from your house. And then you don't want them to hurt your family, so it's like you're protecting your family, in a way, by going.
And they threatened you?
Yeah.
With what?
With things like that, they bomb my house and they gang rape my mum and make me watch, and all sorts of things.
Within just weeks, Jane was trapped and pimped. She was made to have unprotected sex with a succession of men.
It come to a point where it were normal, and sex didn't mean anything, really.
How often was this happening?
Nearly every night.
How many men were involved?
There were loads of men involved. You couldn't keep count. It's not possible to keep count.
The hardest thing to understand is why Jane and girls like her would keep going back. The gangs have a secret weapon. They're not only pimps, many are also drug dealers.
They'd introduce you to cannabis and alcohol, and then after you've been doing that for a while, they'll want to get you to take ecstasy tablets or cocaine, and then they'd want to get you onto heroin or crack cocaine, which is addictive, so that your debt gets built up more because they supply you with your drugs. You don't pay them for them. You have sex with loads of different men to pay for your drugs.
The scale of Jane's supposed debt was huge. At one stage, she was told by the gang that she owed them £300 for 4 cans of lager. £300 she'd have to work off. Through all this, amazingly, Jane's family say they had no idea what was going on. Across the Pennines, there's been so much concern raised in Blackburn that the police set up a dedicated unit, Operation Engage. Its first major case caught two men with a history of preying on young teenagers in care.
On this street, there's a house where two young girls were brought on a regular basis and given alcohol, given drugs, ecstasy pills, and sexually abused.
During the night?
Throughout the night.
How long did that go on for?
Over a 3-month period. They were brought here probably on a daily basis.
And how many men were involved in this abuse?
There are two men that permanently reside at the address, and there would be men that visit. We know of two men that used to come regularly.
And this happened frequently?
Yeah, we think it happened on a daily basis.
The two men visiting the flat for sex were Kaiser Navid, aged 32, and Zulfikar Hussain, 46. Their victims were girls aged just 14, whom we've named Lindsay and Fiona. In both cases, their parents had no idea of the real reason for the huge changes they'd seen in their children.
The very first thing, she used to stop out at night, which was very unusual for her. She always came home on time. She would be very abusive in the home to us all. I used to lock the windows and the doors to try and keep her in, but she would smash the windows, she would climb out windows, she would unlock doors, she would get out no matter what. Just a complete outlook on everything changed. She didn't want to know us. She didn't want to know us as a family.
Panorama has interviewed the other girl in the case, Lindsay, who's still only 16. For protection, her words are spoken by an actress.
We first met Zulfi and Kez in Wally Range in a takeaway. It was great at first. We were just mates and they'd give us cans of lager, ecstasy, cocaine, stuff like that. But we knew that they'd expect something in return, like sex. Zulfi used to say, no shag, no fag. He thought it was funny. But to be honest, we knew what he meant and we didn't really think there was anything that wrong with it.
The girl's parents were distraught. Concerned by her daughter staying out and having sex so young, Megan turned everywhere she could think of for help. When you approached the authorities, police, social services and so on, did you get a good response immediately?
No, not at all. I just had to keep going back to them daily, ringing them up 3-4 times a day sometimes. I never stopped ringing, begging for help. And that's eventually I did get the help.
How long did it take?
It took about 3 months.
3 months?
Yeah.
Blackburn Social Services say they did all they could to keep Fiona safe at home, but eventually had to take her into care. They don't accept that this took 3 months, but do say they faced a steep learning curve over sexual exploitation.
When a young person is identified as being sexually exploited, often the response, especially from social services, will be very slow. It's not always the case in all areas, but in some areas that we work in, the response is just inadequate. This needs urgent intervention as soon as those first signs are identified.
The most serious way a social services department can get involved is to take a child into care. Then they're supposed to be kept not only safe, but under control. But that can be an illusion. Lindsay, the other 14-year-old in the case, was already in care and living perilously close to her abusers, and more able than ever to carry on running wild.
I love being in care. It's like, you can do what you want, really. They can't stop you and they can't, like, lock you in or anything. They can't tell you what to do like your mum and dad would.
Lindsay's friend Fiona was eventually moved into specialist care 100 miles away in North Wales. The idea was to get her away from the abuse and give her a chance to rebuild her life. But within a week, the two men tracked her down and went to abduct her. This was to prove a turning point in the case. They took Lindsay with them from her care home in Blackburn.
They went to North Wales in the vehicle, collected the other 14-year-old and were brought back to the Blackburn area where they were supplied with ecstasy tablets and engaged in sexual activity with the males.
And why did that prove the turning point?
After this event, the girls, the victims, were willing to tell me and disclose offences against them. Up until then, when I've conducted return to home interviews with them, they wouldn't provide any information. They didn't see themselves as victims.
But suddenly they would.
They did. It was very significant to them.
Following this abduction and the further abuse, the girls realised the danger they were in, especially when the men turned violent.
The time that Zulfir attacked Fiona was the worst. I remember hearing her screaming because he was whacking her across the back with a metal bar. I ran in and grabbed it off him, and he was just screaming at her because she wouldn't have sex with him. I suppose in the end, she just had sex with him to keep him quiet.
Faced with the evidence against them, Naveed and Hussein finally pleaded guilty to abduction, having sex with children, and giving them Class A drugs. Last August, they each got prison sentences of almost 6 years. Children taken into care are supposed to be protected by the authorities, but the reality is that the only way to be sure they can't be got at by abusers is to put the children into secure accommodation, effectively locking them up out of harm's way. We've learnt that this has now happened to one of the girls in the case. But the problem is, the only person who gets punished is the victim. Police in Blackburn have been alerted to other cases of children being sexually abused. But this secretive criminal world makes it hard to gather evidence. With few victims turning to the police for help, officers here go to known pick-up points, looking for girls at risk of grooming into prostitution. On Saturday evening, Sergeant Whelan and PC McDermott come across a young girl on her own and looking vulnerable.
Hello?
Are you all right?
In the police? You all right? Yeah, you look freezing.
How old are you?
15.
15? Are you waiting for your mates?
Yeah. What do you want?
Do you know what? We just want to know that you're all right, because obviously
I am all right.
we're police and we just want to make sure that you're safe. And we want
I
to
am
check
all
out how old you are, that's all. You're waiting for your dad. Have you just been to the cinema?
Within a minute, she's changed her story, from being at the pictures with her mates to being with her boyfriend in an Asian area.
Dad's coming to pick her up. She's been to Audley to see her boyfriend, Adam.
Adamu? You don't know his last name? How long have you gone out with him? 3 weeks. No. You're not going to leave you unless we think you're safe. No.
The police are suspicious. They've had intelligence that an Asian man using this name has been grooming girls. Police are more worried when she refuses to give any more information.
Okay, I'm going to get the bus.
She's going to get the bus.
Okay.
Still concerned, the police follow her and want to contact her family.
You give me your home telephone
I don't
number.
know it.
I'll ring your dad.
I don't have a dad.
Right, so we'll ring your mum.
Right.
Who, go on.
Oh.
They manage to get what she says is her mum's phone number. But the girl then suddenly changes her name.
We're just with your daughter now. Sorry, just a second. She's called... Is it... Yeah. How old is... She's how old? 16.
16.
And
Okay,
now
right.
her age has
Is
changed.
she allowed out at the moment? We just wanted to check that she was safe and she wasn't a missing person.
None of this hangs together, but with what seems to be her mother saying she's out with her consent, there's little the police feel they can do. So they give up.
That was a typical scenario of a young girl on her own, doesn't tell you the full story when you speak to them, and you just have to question them further. And, you know, quite easily a car could have turned up, asked her to jump in, and she would have been in and away. So we had to stop and speak to her. That was a bad one, you know.
Why?
What can you do?
You should take hold of them, won't you?
Well, I know.
The authorities are already alert to the danger posed by individual paedophiles. Now they're concerned that evidence from some local communities points to an even more sinister threat: organised sexual exploitation of children by ruthless criminal gangs.
As the cost of drugs has fallen over the past few years, they've seen a fall in their income over half. And to fill that shortfall, they've turned to other methods. And one of the primary methods is to get young white teenage girls into prostitution.
Big money?
Very big money. So, you know, one prostitute could charge anything up to £200 to £300. There's an evil trade. There's a huge demand out there from evil people, and these drug dealers are trying to fill that demand.
I was taken to a flat and shut in the bedroom, and I had to perform sexual acts on different men, and they just like one would come in, do whatever he wanted to do, go out, and then another would come in. They were like a conveyor belt, and it was as though like, but it was easy to do it and then get home than to not do it and not get home.
How many men were involved that day?
There were 5.
Were you getting paid for any of this?
No, you never saw any money, or never saw any money exchanging or anything like that.
Was money changing hands?
Yeah.
How do you know that?
I've been told, like, they'd say smart comments like, oh, thanks for doing us that favour the other day. I got £200 for that.
£200?
Yeah.
And you weren't seeing any of it?
No.
There's no doubt in my mind that it is orchestrated in some parts of the country some of the time by criminal networks, by individual pimps who might work with other colleagues in other towns. We also know that the younger the women, the higher the price. So what the pimp and all the criminal network receives are very significant monies.
Are we talking about thousands, tens of thousands a year for these gangs, or more?
Well, I'd have thought significantly more than that.
We believe from the evidence that we hear from parents about the men who are exploiting their children that it is highly organised. And we know this because we ask parents to keep records, any information that they receive about the men involved. And when we go into a specific area and we've got a large number of parents recording that information, it will often all interlink. So it will be the same men exploiting the young people. The names will be the same, often nicknames admittedly, but a lot of the names will be the same, the phone numbers will be the same. It will all link up, and that's why we believe that it is organised.
Police have had success in breaking up gangs who've trafficked young women into the UK for the sex trade. And grooming of children by predators on the internet has rightly gained a huge amount of attention. But in most cases, those offenders never actually get to meet their victims. British girls being moved around the country for abuse that isn't virtual but very real has attracted almost no attention and not a single prosecution. The Home Office recently said,
"There is no evidence to suggest that internal trafficking is a big problem in the UK. It's a relatively new form of organised crime that is now coming to our attention."
if the pimping of young teenagers is largely a hidden crime, it hasn't yet received the national priority some experts argue it merits. It doesn't, for example, feature in the government's official list of targets for the police. They emphasise burglary, domestic violence, gun crime, a number of other offences, and road traffic collisions, but not child prostitution.
Well, it certainly has to fight for airspace amongst a plethora of other challenges and priorities for the police service. And certainly if forces don't have intelligence about a significant problem existing in their area, they're not likely to include it as part of their policing plan priorities.
But is it getting adequate priority nationally at the moment?
It's getting the priority it needs when instances come to light.
Outside Lancashire, there have been a number of short-term police operations against child sexual exploitation. When they've ended, many have drawn the conclusion that the problem has been solved.
I think it just again highlights the fact that this problem is seemingly not taken seriously and not understood, because if it was understood, people in authority would realise that this is long-term work. You can't just put operations in and resources in, then pull them out. It's not a waste of time, but it needs to be long-term investment from all the organisations involved if this is going to have any long-term impact. These men are in it for the long run. They're not going anywhere, and these authorities, and we all need to be in it for the long run as well, so we can protect these children.
You've had your eye off the ball as far as child prostitution is concerned, haven't you?
No, I don't think so, because
well, then why wasn't it a target if road collisions were?
We introduced new offences, we've introduced all sorts of different units, guidance has gone out to the police, there's been a change in the way that victims are dealt with. We're looking at how we can collect the evidence, we're looking at how we can deal with all of that, and as part of that process, part of that progress, the government now will turn its attention in terms of the targets and the priorities to serious violence. When will the government make the pimping of children a statutory police target? Well, that will take place in the new framework. That's the performance indicators are going to be published in the next couple of months.
But the Home Office has known about the problem for years. A decade ago, officials were so concerned about child prostitution that they funded police and social services projects in Wolverhampton and Nottingham to learn how to tackle it. In Wolverhampton, the team was led by Detective Sergeant Lyndon Whitehouse, who was initially sceptical about the scale of the problem.
I didn't think it was anywhere near as serious as what we uncovered. I wouldn't say I was completely oblivious to the fact that pimps are in existence and that pimps would be involved with children, but I didn't realise it was on anywhere near the scale it was at the time.
Shocked at what he'd found, Sergeant Whitehouse set about bringing the guilty to justice. And in the limited time the pilot project was allowed to run, the results were extraordinary.
Over an 18-month period of time, we investigated 91 cases. In 71 of those cases, we uncovered evidence of coercion and exploitation. In 35 cases, we brought to prosecution. 35 individual adults were charged with offences in connection with the exploitation of children for prostitution, and virtually all of those people were convicted.
So you got almost 35
convicted. And most of those people received custodial sentences, because at the end of the day, this is a serious crime.
His team showed how these crimes could be tackled not only in Wolverhampton, but throughout the country, as they tracked gangs taking young girls from city to city.
They were being moved around the country, and pimps had got a network and knew other pimps in other parts of the country.
How far would they move?
Well, our investigations took us, and I personally travelled to London, Bradford, Cardiff, Luton, Ipswich, Leeds, that kind of network. And of course, many of these children have never been outside of Wolverhampton. So if you move a child 14 years of age out of the town and you move 100 miles away, she's completely isolated, completely in the control and in the hands of ruthless individuals that portray themselves to be caring boyfriends.
In general, how do parents... Once a girl is alienated from all her familiar supports, the consequences can be grave.
What we see is that many women who work as prostitutes in adulthood were sexually exploited as children. Women in prostitution as adults didn't wake up one morning and think, I'm going to be a prostitute. There was a process by which they got there, and the evidence we see and the information that we receive suggests that many, if not the majority, were exploited as children.
In Blackburn, police become concerned about two teenage girls out at night, 10 miles from home, and seemingly unaware of the risk they're running.
So what are you doing over here?
Somehow they've found their way to a dark back street where there are 4 cars of men mysteriously waiting.
No, I just need to check your names and your dates of birth. Why? Because I work on something called the Engaged team, and we work with young girls who are being sexually exploited by older males. Obviously, you're 15 and 16, and so we need to make sure that you're safe and that you're not missing.
With nothing obviously criminal, police can't compel the girls to cooperate. But they're eager to talk to the men hanging round.
We don't know now. We don't
None of what?
None of our pick these young girls up and that.
Why do many people do that?
Probably, no.
Do you think? Round here?
No, I blame the parents, don't you think?
Do you?
Yeah.
Do you not blame? Do you not?
I definitely blame the parents.
Do you not blame?
Locked up at home.
Do you not blame the males that pick them up?
No, not really, no.
And use them for sex?
Not really, no.
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 Okay.
I mean, if my sister were out that time, I'd rather than send her back home.
Well, that's not the way, is it?
Why isn't it? That is the proper way, and that's how we should be.
The difficulty we've got is that if you haven't got some form of intelligence or some form of information to back up what you can see going on in front of you, what you can see going on in front of you may very well be just innocent behaviour, just kids being kids. If we had some information on who those girls were, for example, and that they are in the middle of some sexual exploitation, then obviously we can take a bit more positive action with them.
In this shadowy world, it's hard to establish the facts about patterns of abuse. Child prostitutes may not be visible standing on street corners. They're far more likely to be hidden away in some flat above a taxi firm. But around the country, it is clear that gangs of different racial origins are principally involved.
We uncovered evidence against people from Asian backgrounds, white backgrounds and black backgrounds. Predominantly in Wolverhampton, the pimps that we charged with offences were predominantly black Afro-Caribbean. But I have also travelled during the course of my investigations, and I've presented seminars in Yorkshire, for example, where I know that's not the case and where I know that Asians are the main culprits.
I think the police are overcautious in dealing with this issue openly because they fear being branded racist, and I think that's wrong.
But there could be a problem, couldn't there, for the police if they were to say this is principally done by Asian gangs? This could stir up racial tensions.
These are criminals. They should be treated as criminals. They're not Asian criminals, they're not Muslim criminals, they're not white criminals. They are criminals, and they should be treated as criminals.
If offences are disclosed, they have to be investigated. There's no way you can just conveniently ignore them because of a certain sensitivity of whatever kind it is. They have to be thoroughly investigated.
You don't think the police are too cautious in approaching this because of the possibility of stirring up racial tension?
Certainly not within my experience, and I say the experience that I have is to the contrary. Where evidence has been displayed in that way, it has been followed through. But I can't say that that's the certainty in all cases, because I have to talk within my experience.
After its pilot projects, the government changed the law and issued guidance to police forces. Grooming is now a specific offence, and children are now seen as victims. But there have been only a dozen convictions for pimping them. A decade ago in Wolverhampton, police learned how to protect victims and gain convictions. Lessons they fear have been lost. Pimps boast that they can do as they like, and all too often they're right.
There are very few people in our prisons up and down the country with convictions for these sorts of offences.
Does that mean that if a gang decides that it wants to pimp young girls, they're pretty much likely to get away with it?
Well, that's a bold assertion, but the evidence would support that assertion.
So the answer is yes?
Absolutely.
The government points to a rising annual number of successful prosecutions for child grooming and prostitution offences.
It's 44 people convicted under the offences under the 2003 Act. If we look back to the 8 years under the old Act, if we look back to the 8 years, the decade before 2003, there were actually just 6 convictions for these sorts of offences.
But isn't Professor Barrett right when he says to us, if somebody wants to pimp young children in this country, they're likely to get away with it?
No, he's not right. And
where are the convictions?
Well, as I say, we've got 44 convictions.
44 out of a huge number, like 5,000 children.
Well, it's 44, which is an increase on what we saw before. But is that good enough? No, it's not. We want to do more.
Many cases don't make it to court because the children involved are too scared to talk. One officer told us they're usually much more frightened of their pimps than they are of the law.
Some of them are quite terrified, and with right reason. We had a case in the West Midlands where a girl had her tongue nailed to the table when she threatened to tell. I worked with a girl who had her hair yanked back, her head pulled back, mouth open, with a kettle of boiling water held above her throat. You don't tell or run away if you've got a kettle of boiling water held above your throat. And then there's all sorts of networks of these boyfriends, so that even in cases where I know that men have been remanded into custody, girls have been threatened over the phone.
One day I was picked up by an older man who was a lot older than me and took me to a park. I didn't know this man, and then I was told. He pulled a gun out from under the seat and put it to my head and told me that I was going to die in 3 seconds, and then counted down from 3 to 1 and pulled the trigger. But it wasn't loaded, and he found that amusing.
The family reported Jane's case to the police, but she then withdrew her allegations, she says, because officers couldn't guarantee her safety. The force concerned say they investigated the case but couldn't find enough evidence for a prosecution. Jane is now considering an action claiming police negligence. Experts have told Panorama that they're reminded of the position with domestic violence 20 years ago. Everything hangs on the key witness, and she won't talk, either because she's petrified or she blames herself. There's a new approach to family violence these days. Abused partners get protection and the support they need, but that's often missing for exploited children. It's as if we still expect them to simply leave their pimps.
I think in the past we used to say that with domestic abuse. Why on earth does she stay with him? I think it's understanding the emotional traumas that these young people have gone through. I mean, we know on average it can take 7 years for an adult woman to leave a violent partner, and that's a mature adult woman. We're talking here about children, 13, 14, 15-year-old children who haven't got that understanding or maturity.
The officer who ran Wolverhampton's successful operation a decade ago argues that police need committed teams to achieve similar results.
My view is that the only way it will be uncovered and the only way to stop what is a really, really serious crime is to have dedicated units, as we do now with domestic violence and things like that, which historically is a subject that was never recognised, is to have dedicated units to deal with it.
With child prostitution?
With child prostitution, because my experience is that it's occurring in all major cities across the United Kingdom.
We've been able to find only 2 police forces which have dedicated units working with other agencies. In Blackburn, the new police unit fighting child prostitution works with social services, education and health teams. But does it have enough officers for the task it faces?
I suppose people would argue there are never enough police officers or social workers.
There's you full-time and 1 part-time colleague from the police?
Yes, part-time sergeant working on it.
Does that seem to be enough to you?
No. When we do have a complex case that comes in, it's many, many hours of investigation.
Doesn't it represent a shocking failure by the government that a decade after the pilot projects that the Home Office set up showed that this was an enormous problem and that it could be tackled, you're still sitting here saying to me, we should be doing better?
No, I'm saying we have in many respects done better, particularly in terms of the support that we've given to victims. If we talk to the police, if we talk to the prosecutors, we know that it's a difficult area to prosecute. Part of the problem is how we give the confidence to the victims in order to give evidence, how we give the confidence to people around them.
They found all this in Wolverhampton and Nottingham a decade ago. They found out how to do it. And the problem is you haven't made police forces up and down the country do it.
Well, we've issued the guidance to police forces. We know now. Well, we've issued guidance, and the guidance is going to be updated. The police are looking at how they ensure that that is enforced. And of course, alongside that, each police force now has child abuse investigation units. So those units are operating and functioning.
The next day, the Home Office emailed Panorama to confirm that pimping children will be covered in new police targets. And the government has said it'll produce a warning video for use in all schools. Meanwhile, one of the oldest crimes in history continues to threaten British children at the threshold of adult life.
I was just an innocent little girl who went from playing with the dolls to being this adult who was having sex with loads of different men.
On Monday, 6 weeks after police search teams started digging beneath a children's home on Jersey, Panorama's cameras go inside to the heart of the investigation. That's Jersey, Island of Secrets, back in our usual slot on Monday at 8:30.
Well, back to tonight, Morton Kemp and referee Graham Pole are among the guests. Next for This Week.